Good afternoon. Today we're here with Dr. Woods and we're going to talk about 2021 school year. And I know we all felt as we were going through March, April, and May that the craziness may subside or the craziness may have taken a back seat. But unfortunately, as the virus and everything else has continued, and we've seen some spikes here lately, not only in Texas, but in other states, the craziness is still with us. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a different brand of craziness than there was in the spring. You know, in the spring, we were so busy adjusting to all of us, right? This isn't just true of educators, obviously, but all of us were just so busy adjusting to our new normal and still trying to provide education for kids in our case. It had a craziness, but it also, like anything after you do it for a while, established a bit of a pattern, and I think we continued to improve throughout, and frankly we learned a lot that's going to benefit us this fall. But could predict early on, by late April or early May, that the start of the new school year would be much more traumatic, much more challenging than closing out the old school year. And don't get me wrong, it had its own set of challenges. How do you safely do graduation, which was, very challenging, very emotional for folks. But this is a whole different series of challenges.
And let's talk about that challenge, because I think one of the biggest challenges on the table for you, the school board, district personnel, teachers, students, parents, unfortunately, whatever may be decided at this moment, the new normal is you can almost expect by 5 p.m. or 6 p.m. or 7 p.m. tonight for that new normal to have shifted. How does that affect trying to come up with a schedule for 100,000 students?
Yeah, it makes it pretty challenging. I've kind of jokingly said I think we're on version 478 of the plan, because what we've been dealing with is, and of course everybody is iterating in a brand new space, right? So I don't want to cast stones, but we have dealt with shifting state guidance that has the number of changes that we've dealt with, the number of things that we've asked for and then been told no, and then 2 or 3 weeks later been said, oh yeah, that's fine. It has changed the plan over and over and over again, and that accelerated into June and the month of July, which has made, frankly, getting school started quite challenging. When the board and I made the call to start the first couple of weeks 100% virtual, frankly, that was part of the reason, is because we were struggling to be able to iterate a plan that families could understand, right? That was anything more than just nonsense. And so that 2 weeks, I hope, will provide us with the stability we need so everybody knows what it's going to look like, right? I have a firm grasp of what that's going to look like. And then after that, I'm hopeful, if the public health conditions allow, that we can start to slowly bring students back into the building. And that plan as of today, right, whatever today is, the 11th of August, feels more firm than it did in the past, and feels like we've got a path forward. We generally know how we're going to head. However, we know, if we've learned nothing else in the last 5 months, it's that we'll make a plan and we'll head down that road and realize something in that didn't work, and we'll have to monitor and adjust, and that's just a part of all of our reality. But making a plan to start the school year has been, and again, like I said, you could start to see this in late April and early May, that this work was going to be much harder and much more challenging for people to understand than the closing out of the last school year.
Absolutely. But Dr. Woods, adding to the stress of the district, adding the stress to your office, different facilities, obviously being built in 1970
sure,
for a population here, shifting population inside Bear County. How do you, and I think, and we want to stress this today, the district has done a really good job of when we bring the kids back on campus, when the students return, the social distancing and protocols are going to be adhered to,
Right.
followed. But hasn't that added to the stress? Because unfortunately, not all campuses, and this isn't casting shade in any neighborhoods or anything, but they're not created equally.
Sure. Yeah.
How does the district handle that?
Yeah, so there's a couple of ways to answer that question. One is just the way schools have been designed forever, and that is for efficiency, right? Schools are meant to put relatively large groups of young people together, educate them in a way that's relatively cost effective, and that model doesn't allow for a lot of social distancing, right? Schools were never designed for that. And so what we've literally done is go look at 7,000 individual classrooms and say, okay, given the square footage and the configuration in this classroom, if we want X number of feet between every child, how many students can fit in this room, right? And so there's a calculation for every classroom in the school district. And it is different. Older schools have a tendency to have smaller classrooms. That was the design standard at the time. So even at the, in what the city and our plan will call a green zone, right, where it's relatively safe to go to school, what we envision is that in some of our schools we'll be able to fit 14, 15, 16 kids in a room and still maintain social distancing. In other schools, particularly older campuses, that will be a smaller number, right? It's the math just works that way. And so that's what we've done to try to get at that issue. And that is probably our kind of our best case scenario for how school can operate. If we in San Antonio can get our public health metrics a lot better than they are sitting today, we feel like we're going to be able to bring at least some students into the building. We're going to offer families some choice, right? They're going to have some say about which mode they want to be educated in. But we don't see, and I don't know that any of us see anytime soon, that the notion of social distancing or face coverings is going to go away, right? We just don't see that, and so we're not planning for it, right? You know, our kind of green zone, our best case scenario, still incorporates 6 foot of social distance and face coverings for almost for everybody.
But let's talk about the green zone. Let's talk about some numbers here, because I know you have felt the brunt of some of the protest and the anger of, oh, it's not safe, why are we even thinking
Sure.
about doing this? But currently, we have seen dramatic drops in the number of cases. Yesterday, we were at 200 and change. Something else that I don't think a lot of people understand about the hospital numbers, the numbers that they're releasing, they're not all from Bexar County.
Yeah.
They're from surrounding areas. So do you see that maybe, just maybe, people are starting to do the right thing? Things are returning to normal, but in a way, this is going to complicate your life. And what I mean by that is, let's say by the end of September, those numbers have returned at the end of June status, where we're only having 50 cases a day or
Right.
less, and less hospitalizations. My understanding with the current plan, after 9 weeks, a student can opt to return back to school if they wish,
Right.
or stay out. Let's say 90% of the student population elects to return to the classrooms. How do you juggle the ball?
Yeah, that'll be, and that's, you may have seen that at some point in the not too distant past, on another day where we got a massive shift in state guidance, I said very publicly in a board meeting, I said, look, if we feel like social distancing is a non-negotiable, and I feel like we're going to, and that scenario were to play out, we would have no choice but to challenge state guidance, whatever that looks like, whether that's in court or get them to rewrite the guidance, or whatever that looks like. But that's true. The way the rule is written today is that after the first 8 weeks of the school year, that essentially you've got to open the door for all comers. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't go to our families and say, hey, look, we just don't have that capacity right now. We want to keep your students safe. We want to keep everybody's kiddos safe. We want to keep our teachers safe. So we really want you to stay, if you can manage it, stay in virtual learning so that we can manage the building safely. That we can make that argument. What worries me is that we don't have any protection from the state on that argument, and I feel like we need it, frankly. It is just hard for me to imagine that 2 months from now, 3 months from now, that the notion of social distancing and face coverings is going to go away. I just don't think that's realistic. And so we need to be able to plan for that, right? But given the numbers that we have today, and so take that for what it's worth, this community is full of very intelligent people, and they know what's going on with the virus. When we surveyed our community in early June, one of the very lowest times for viral transmission in Bexar County, we had, once you explain safety protocols to folks, we had about 3/4 say, I want to come back to the building. Now, of course, this is early June. Exact same survey goes out in mid-July. Obviously, the situation in 6 weeks had changed dramatically. That number drops to more like 25%, right, or 32%, somewhere in there. It essentially it flipped, it had inverted. And what we see today, we're out asking families now, if we started tomorrow, tell us what you would want, is about 35% want to be in the building. And we think if that number held stable, that's a workable situation in most of our campuses, right? In a green zone, that's a workable situation in most of our campuses. But we also know that as those numbers get better, more and more folks are going to want to elect to be in the building. And that's understandable, reasonable, right? And we're just trying to find a way to manage it so that we can educate kids in the best way that we know how. And for the vast majority of kids, that's in the building. Everybody, I don't know that anybody actually disagrees with that. But we've got to do it in a way that's safe, and that means we've got to have some control over the capacity, the number of humans in that building, or in that classroom, or in that cafeteria or library, or whatever the space is.
And something else that I really want to touch on right now, because I think it's appropriate. You keep using the term safe. You talk about keeping the students safe. You keep talking about keeping the parents and the teachers and the community safe. Sometimes I dislike social media because it's so easy to dogpile, and somebody throws a kernel out there,
sure,
and it grows. A true statement from you right now, how important is safety of the teachers, of the students, of the community, drives your decision?
It's paramount. It's the first thing, right? It's absolutely the first. If you had to list, we're essentially balancing two things. We're balancing safety of kids and their families, and of course our staff, with providing the very best instructional program we can. And so those are the two things that we're trying to balance. And unfortunately, we're in a conversation. That's not fair. There are some folks who want to cast that conversation as you got to choose A or B. You can't manage both. And I guess what I'm trying to lay out is, I think there is a nuanced way to do this. And if you think about it as a teeter-totter, those two items, the fulcrum, the balance point between them is this notion of public health metrics, right? That if we can not be in a big hurry, either way, either to bring people in or to put them out. If we can not be in a big hurry, if we can make our decisions using a set of metrics that doctors are starting to kind of come around on and agree on, then I think we can do this in a way that balances those two forces. Will it be ideal? Of course not. We won't live in an ideal world, but it'll be better than anything else we could have come up with. So safety is absolutely paramount. Nobody wants anybody to fall ill. It makes no sense, right? That doesn't do any of us any good. But that has to be paired with there are students who desperately need to be in the building for a whole. I can list you a whole series of reasons why that's true. Because of their own educational needs, because of physical disabilities, because of a dangerous situation in their home, because they need nutrition. There's just a whole list of reasons, right? Then you've got a group of kids whose families, in order to put food on the table, really must work outside of the home, right? They're not in a position to, as some of us, I guess, enjoy working from home, right? They're just not in that place. And call it right or wrong, people can disagree. Families have come to count on the school to satisfy that need, right? And it's something we do. So they're just kids that need to be in the building for a whole host of reasons. And if we can do that safely and educate them well, then it seems like that's a good place to do that. So we are trying hard to cast a position between the two camps who are the, you can never go back group, or the everybody ought to be back in the building tomorrow group. It seems to me like neither of those is reasonable, and that we can craft a place out, and it's going to be messy, and we're gonna it's not going to be linear. We're going to go this way, and then we're going to adjust and go this way, and back and forth and so forth. But it seems like to me that's better than just throwing up our hands and saying, well, we just can't make this work.
I see three large white elephants in the room, and I want to address each one. But before we get to those, I think it's important, most people don't understand, you cannot become a superintendent of a school without having been in the classroom. So you certainly have been in the classroom,
Oh,
have you
sure.
not?
Absolutely.
And you have been in the education business for how long?
28 years.
If a young Dr. Woods was sitting in his college classroom and the professor walked in and said, one of the scenarios we need to train you for in your teaching career is that all schools are going to close. You're going to send everybody home and have to come up with a online learning system on the fly immediately.
Right.
What would your reaction have been?
Well, just that the person was probably crazy, right? That, it's just outlandish, right? And I'll say, I have these little flashes of recollection of what the things we were talking about in the last week in February and the first week in March. And I distinctly remember a couple of, and I'll admit, kind of half-hearted conversations where I thought to myself, are we really having this conversation right now about what if? We had some of these what if conversations. Looking back on them, thank God we had them. It enabled us to put a few things in place so that you probably recall that week that it really got kicked off in the United States was spring break here in this part of the world. And we made some decisions to have teachers take devices home, and we made some great calls up in our curriculum group to start rewriting some curriculum that was going to be covered right after spring break so that it could be done in a virtual format. Thank goodness, because we'd have been another week or 10 days behind had we not done those things. But I do remember these kind of, and again, sitting right here thinking, do we really need to be having this conversation right now? Sure enough, we did. But yeah, it would have been lunacy, right? I mean, nobody would have ever thought that would happen. And I'll be honest, James, when we made the call to close, because if you recall, those were local decisions early on. So the governor didn't come in and close schools until mid-April. So for that first month, 5 weeks, those were local decisions. When we made the call to close schools that first week right after spring break, I announced 1 week, right? Let's give ourselves a little time to stand up an online school if we have to. But I really didn't think that's where we were going. I really thought we'll figure this out. We'll get it under control. We'll give some families the option to stay home if they're really fearful, and then everybody else will be back in the building. And you got to Tuesday of that week, and it was like, no way. It's not going to happen, right? It's just, there's no way. So we extended 2 more weeks, and then got halfway through that period of time and extended 2 more weeks. And by then the governor had pretty much shut everything down. But it was that was a very interesting time, full of anxiety for a whole different set of reasons. And I think what's so ironic about that when we look back on it is that we closed schools at a time where viral transmission was really very minor, right? Now, hindsight's 20/20, and we know a lot more now than we did 5 months ago. But it is somewhat ironic that the thresholds we used to close schools in March, don't look anything like
Like
the
they do
thresholds
now.
we are experiencing now. Exactly. Yeah.
So the first white elephant, and you kind of touched on it in your previous answer where you said communities have seen that schools are necessary for children to attend because parents are working, that kind of thing. I believe some of the teachers feel that educators have turned into babysitters.
Mm.
How do you respond to that? Because I know you do not believe that your teachers are nothing more than babysitters.
Yeah. I mean, it is a profession, right? Teaching is a profession. It takes done well, it takes an incredible skill set that includes technical type skills, but it also includes human interaction type skills and empathy and emotional intelligence and all those kinds of things that we really don't teach. We just look for when we're out looking for somebody called a teacher. So the notion that teachers are babysitting is just lunacy, right? It's just ridiculous. If I showed you a curriculum guide for 8th grade social studies and said, okay, you need to make relationships with 150 12-year-olds and you need to teach them this amount of stuff in 170 days, you'd think that's ridiculous, at 50 minutes a pop. You'd say it's not doable, right? So it's an incredible skill set, and it's and in the people that I know who do it the best, it's a calling, right? They were called to this work. It's like people are called to the ministry. It is a similar thing, among people who are just, you walk in their classroom and you're like, my God, they were born to teach, right? This is exactly where they're supposed to be. This is what they're supposed to be doing. It's a calling for those people, and they do it in spite of low wages and sometimes less than ideal working conditions, and it almost universally are bright people who could have elected to do other things, right?
So the second white elephant, and this one's probably even bigger. We know that local schools outside the San Antonio area, Bandera, Bernie, Comal County, for instance, have already started back with band camps and others, and you've had one incident in Comal County where there's already been a positive result.
Right.
Dr. Woods, we're fooling ourselves if we're not to say that somebody's not going to walk into the building that is going to be positive.
Oh yeah, I agree completely. I mean, if folks can acquire the disease at HEB with a mask on, then they can acquire it in a school or in a department store or wherever. And so, yes, agreed. Schools are not going to be immune from what every other institution in our society is immune from. Now, that said, can we, because of social distancing, because of mask wearing, because of plexiglass installation in high traffic areas, because of staggered arrival and dismissal, because of a hybrid schedule that keeps our high school populations from being so large in any one day, can you go through all those things and mitigate it? Of course you can. You can. But I agree, it is unreasonable to expect in a gathering of any size, even with all those safety practices, that somebody won't acquire the disease. Now, they may well not acquire it in the building at the school, but out in the rest of their life, and then of course come to the building, and that's something we'll have to deal with. But the other thing that I think is important on this point is that we don't see that a positive test in a building means that the building is automatically completely shut down and everybody has to go away for a period of time. It's part of the reason you put all these protocols into place so that when a positive test occurs, it can be investigated, it can be case investigated, and you can make a reasonable decision about, all right, let's take, I typically answer this question with this example. So let's take a third grader. And the third grader goes home, and some parent or a grandparent, somebody has acquired the disease somewhere. The third grader gets the disease, comes to school, very likely is asymptomatic, but somebody in the family tests positive, so the rest of the family gets tested, right? So the third grader tests positive, may have mild symptoms, may have hardly any symptoms, may have no symptoms. we don't see that the entire elementary school needs to close down. If that third grader's really only been interacting with their classmates, that maybe say 8 or 10 kids in that class, physically in that classroom, and of course the teacher, that's the group that obviously has to go out of the building. But we don't see that the whole school has to close in that case, especially if we're careful with how we do recess and how we do lunch and how we do the bus and how we do all those other things that kids do during the day, and keep them from interacting with large groups of kids. Now, in a secondary school, bigger populations, kids change courses because there's so many courses offered to our secondary students. That's going to be harder, frankly. The work's going to be tough on contact tracing and all that. But we will do what we can not to just automatically close a school every time there's a positive case. What we're really trying to avoid, and everybody is trying to avoid this, is the whole in of the building, out of the building, into the building, out of the building. That's terribly disruptive for kids and for their parents, their families. And so we'll do as much as we can to keep that from happening. But at the same time, we have stood up, and this was not true in the spring, obviously, because we created it on the fly. We've stood up a system that I think will manage that. If that third grader and his or her classmates have to go out of the building for a period of days, they'll keep their same teacher, they'll be in the same electronic system, they'll have a device that they can use, they'll keep on keeping on. And then once it's reasonable for folks to come on back. It's same teacher, same device, same electronic system, so that it's nimble enough to manage. If I choose to start in the building and I have to leave and then I come back, it's nimble enough to manage that kind of in and out. But obviously we want to minimize the in and out as much as we can.
I want to stress here though, I know when we're talking about health, I know when we're talking about our kids, emotions are involved.
Mm-hmm.
But what I think the takeaway from this last answer, we as a community, we as a group of teachers, we as a group of parents, need to be slow to push the panic button. We need to be slow in saying, oh, well, it started, or, well, we knew that was...
Right.
Unfortunately, the only true expectation of today's circumstances or outcome of today's circumstances is it's probably going to happen. That is the one thing that we can say is sure. It's probably going to happen.
Right.
To say that any school in the United States is going to make it through the whole school year and not have it happen once, but the community needs to be supportive, the community needs to be patient, the community needs to trust the professionals to take care of the situation.
Yeah, and you know, I guess here's the other thing. You know, while we won't allow a positive test to completely close a building, there is a number of positive tests where we would say, not safe, not doing it here. Everybody go home for a period of time. And Metro Health will be contributing to that conversation as well, right? We're going to have reporting requirements, school by school reporting requirements that they're going to look at, but you know, that is, we will, in this new era, we will be doing a lot of analysis of what percentage of kids are absent, and do we know why? Because we're looking for an outbreak, right? We're looking for a pattern, and if we see it, then we're going to say, we're done. Everybody goes out to virtual learning, right? That's just, it is what it is. Hopefully we won't have to do that in the whole school district, right? Hopefully that won't be the case. But if we have a series of cases, adults or kids, doesn't matter, in a building, we're fully prepared to close the building and everybody goes out to distance learning. It's just the way it is.
Adding to the confusion, compounding your headaches, October's going to bring around the normal flu season.
Yeah.
Has the district thought of some protocols or started writing a roadmap of what do we do with regular flu?
The issue for us is going to be, and of course, you know, I'm no doctor, so this is not my area of expertise, but this, especially in children, the symptoms are so similar that it's going to be very challenging to parse out without a test, obviously, who has what. And so what we'll do is err on the side of caution. Anybody who has what we used to call flu-like symptoms that we now call COVID symptoms will be treated as though they may have COVID, and thus isolated. Every school will have an isolation room for a student that we believe might be symptomatic with COVID. And there will be mistakes made in that way, in that we will have a student who has the flu, but we will isolate them just like we would a student today suspecting that they had COVID, and we'll be wrong sometimes, right? They didn't have COVID, they had the flu. Either way, best not to be around a bunch of other kids in the building. So if there is a good thing in the answer to that question, it's that the symptoms are enough alike that we'll treat both of those communicable diseases as you need to be isolated until we can get somebody to pick you up. Then we're going to ask your family to get you tested, flu and COVID, so that we know what's going on. And again, we're looking for an outbreak, right? We're looking for what that pattern could be. And then obviously, if it's flu, we'll treat it like we always do, right? You, without fever 3 days, you come back to the building. If it's COVID, obviously there's a whole different set of protocols that have to be monitored before that child can come back. But we will, and we haven't done this in the past, because we've been able to manage flu pretty effectively in this part of the world, but we will have an isolation room at every campus to kind of accommodate that separation of a child from everybody else once we realize there may be some symptoms.
But the takeaway from all of this is, and I stress this with Stan Lang and athletics, if your child is feeling sick for that day,
Mm-hmm.
if you think your child is running a fever,
Right.
do not give them 2 Tylenol, pat them on the head, and
Right.
send them to school.
Right.
Keep them at home.
It's just a new era, right? You know, all of us who are working parents have had that battle in our own brain, right? It's just things have changed sufficiently now that we need to go back and really double down on what we've always said, and that is, if your child's ill or you suspect your child is ill, please keep them at home. And that's pretty important to everybody else's health and safety these days, because a cold is one thing, COVID is different, right? And we've just got to take it more seriously. That will be a challenge. You know, one of the things we're going to be doing is health screenings for students and staff, and depending upon kind of where we are in the matrix, more frequently the more dangerous the public health situation seems. But health screenings only work as well as the honesty of the person filling out the screening, right? That's it. You know, if I'm truthful, it works great. But if I'm not, then health screening doesn't do you a whole lot of good, right?
So the final white elephant in the room, and is if you didn't have enough plates to juggle or concerns on your mind, we're already hearing that Governor Abbott has said you've got to do a 5% cut right now on the budget. Budget is coming up. You have to pass one by the end of September. With declining revenue, with increased costs because of having to revamp school for COVID, what do you see? And some of the reports I'm hearing is it could take 5 years or longer to even reverse this trend and get us back to stable. For the next 2 years, 3 years, could there be staffing cuts? Could there be program cuts? What do you see as the future of education?
Yeah, so that crystal ball is pretty cloudy. It's very challenging to predict. I'll try to answer it in 2 ways. The immediate, the 2021 school year, I do not anticipate state-type cuts. I think all of us are concerned, school people are concerned about enrollment, and will we maintain the enrollment that we've staffed off of in the winter and the spring. But assuming there's no big loss of enrollment, and assuming there aren't any state cuts in the short term, then we're kind of, in Northside, we're kind of in a stasis. We have not cut, we've not reduced staffing. Now, we've not filled a bunch of positions that in a normal year, frankly, we would have. We did not do any pay increase for any employee in the school district because we're trying to shelter ourselves against what we think may be coming, and that would happen subsequent to a legislative session. Texas is about, like many states, is a balanced budget state. You can only spend as much as you can take in, and after a few accounting tricks, it pretty much is what it is, you know. And so, do we anticipate cuts in the 2021 legislative session? Yeah, I think we've got to, right? I think it would be foolish not to. We saw a similar situation after the Great Recession, where in the 2011 session, so 10 years before, there were pretty substantial cuts to public ed, and specific to Northside, the cut was almost $60 million a year in revenue. It was significant. I mean, we essentially took a 10% cut to our revenue one year to the next. And if that were to happen again, you've got to be ready for that. You got to shelter yourself from that. What we were able to do in 2011, due to some really strong leadership from John Folks, the superintendent at that time, and from our board, was to plane down, not fall off a cliff, right? And so did we have fewer staff? Absolutely. Did we do a little bit of programming cut? Not a lot, but a little bit, yes. But it was slow and over time instead of just this traumatic cut. That'll be our goal going forward. That if we have to reduce staff, it happens by attrition and not by a reduction in force or some kind of layoff. And that if program cuts have to be made, they're relatively minor, relatively small groups of kids, those kinds of things. It'll be, do the least harm, right? That'll be the goal, and to get the budget to where you need it. But the answer to the question in a broad sense is yes, this is a public health crisis, and everybody gets that. It is also, for state and local governmental organizations, an absolute financial crisis. And not by anybody's fault, it just is. And so we're going to have to work through it, and it will take some time. And we'll have to be vigilant in working with the legislature in the spring of 2021 not to protest cutting, but to ensure that the cuts happen in the way that are the least painful, the least harmful for school children. And I think they're going to be open to that conversation, much more so than in 2011. And I think we can do it in a way that, and I'll only speak for us, because I'm sure you could talk to some districts around who will say virtually any cut, and I'm in bad trouble, But I think we will be able to, if needed, to kind of slowly plane down rather than have a dramatic change from May of one year to August of the next, So that's my anticipation.
So the last thing, school is almost a week and a half away from opening the doors.
Right.
The
virtual doors, yeah.
Yes. What message do you want to send to the parents, the teachers, and the community about Northside and what to expect?
Yeah, so I think, I guess the message would be, this school district has done a really fine job by its patrons and by its kids, its children, for a long time, for decades. And that's not going to change. Has COVID changed the way we're going to educate kids, at least temporarily? Yes, it has. And maybe even out into the out years. But I think we're going to have, if you're a distance learner, you will have the same teacher attention and rigor as a student who's sitting in a classroom. You will have the same curricular experience, if you will, and it won't look like it did when we stood it up in 3 days in the spring. If you're an in-the-building learner for any period of time, you're going to see those social distancing practices, those PPE wearing, the protocols that we all experience when we go out in public these days. That's going to be true in your school as well. And it's not going to be optional, right? That's not going to be a choice. It's going to be, if you're going to be with us in the building, and God knows we want you here, you got to work with us on this stuff. If you're older than about first or second grade, you got to wear your face covering, right? We just got to have you doing it. And so, will it look different than it has in the past? Of course it will. Can we still provide high quality education to kids? You bet we can. And we will through the transition period with COVID, and then however we come out on the other end of that. You know, we contemplate that we may have, even when we're in a perpetual green zone with regard to COVID, we'll have some families that just say, you know what, this virtual learning thing, it works for me. It's good. My kids are having a great experience. We're going to continue to support you in that way, you know. So that's, I guess, probably a long way to answer that question, but you know, what people have come to expect of Northside School District from a professionalism standpoint, from a rigor standpoint, from a quality of education standpoint is not going to change.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
You bet.